The sound came like thunder on old wood, three slow, heavy knocks that rattled the cabin door. Sarah froze. Her hand stopped mid-motion over the small kerosene lamp she had been trimming, and for a moment the only sound in the cabin was the whisper of the flame struggling against the draft. The knocks didn't belong in her world anymore. For 10 long years, no one had crossed her threshold, not a neighbor, not a friend, not even a lost traveler desperate for water. Her little cabin sat on the farthest edge of the desert, miles from the wagon road, tucked against a line of scraggly cottonwoods. Out here, silence was her only companion, silence and the wind, but that knock, it cleaved the stillness in two. Her heart pounded as she stared at the door. The wood was old, warped with desert heat, its planks scarred by sandstorms. No one had reason to come. No one even remembered she lived here, or so she had prayed. The wind moaned against the shutters, carrying with it the wild scent of dust and sagebrush. Beyond the walls, the storm had gathered its fury. She had seen the sky split just before sundown, bruised purple clouds rolling like cavalry across the horizon. Now the storm bore down with unrelenting force, rattling the loose boards of her roof and hurling sand in sheets that stung like 1,000 tiny needles against the windows. But the storm hadn't knocked. The knock came again, louder this time, as though demanding. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, tight and painful. Her body screamed for her to move, to answer, to do something, but her legs refused. They were heavy, rooted in place, as though the floorboards themselves held her captive. 10 years. 10 years since she had spoken a word. 10 years since she had allowed anyone inside. Her voice had been stolen in the fire, her words locked deep in her chest where no one could reach them. And after the fire came the whispers, the pointing fingers, the cruel eyes of the townsfolk. They had said she was cursed, that she had brought ruin with her own hands. Her husband had turned away first. Then her friends. Then everyone. So she had left slipping away under the cover of night, walking until her feet bled, carrying nothing but a blanket and the clothes on her back. The desert swallowed her and she let it. Out here, she found solitude. Out here, no one demanded her voice. No one asked her to explain. No one remembered. Until now. Sarah pressed her palm against the table for steadiness. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting the room in a trembling glow. Shadows stretched long and strange across the rough-hewn walls, twisting like specters. She could almost imagine the fire again, the roar of it, the way it had licked the sky and devoured everything she loved. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her throat, to the thin raised scar just below her collarbone. The scar that had changed her forever. A third knock boomed against the door. This one shook the hinges. Whoever stood outside was not passing by. They wanted in. Her mind raced. It could be a bandit, a drunkard lost in the storm, a bounty hunter searching for prey. She had heard rumors, faint as whispers on the wind, of raiders prowling these landsmen who would take whatever they wanted, leaving behind nothing but ashes. Her eyes darted to the rifle mounted above the hearth. She hadn't touched it in years. Dust clung to the barrel like cobwebs. Her hands twitched, remembering the weight of it, the way her father had taught her to shoot tin cans when she was just a girl. But lifting that rifle would mean breaking the vow she had made to herself the night she walked into exile. Never again would she raise a weapon. Never again would she take part in violence. The storm howled louder, battering the shutters until they clattered against their frames. Lightning split the sky, throwing white fire through the gaps in the boards. For an instant, the cabin blazed with light, and she thought she saw the shadow of a figure on the other side of the door, tall, broad, unmoving. Her breath shuddered. Slowly, trembling, she stepped toward the door. The floor groaned beneath her bare feet, every sound amplified in the tense silence. She reached for the latch, then stopped, her hand hovering inches from the iron handle. Her chest ached with the weight of 1,000 questions. Who could it be? What did they want? Why now, after all this time? Another knock so close it felt as though the stranger's fist pressed against her very heartbeat. Sarah closed her eyes. 10 years of silence had built walls around her heart. 10 years of silence had kept her safe. But now, as the storm raged, and the unknown waited on the other side of the door, she realized the truth. Silence could not keep the world away forever. With a breath that tasted of dust and fear, Sarah slid back the latch and opened the door. The door swung open, and the storm rushed in like a wild beast. Sand and rain lashed at Sarah's face, stinging her skin as the desert wind howled through the cabin. She squinted into the chaos, and there, framed by the lightning's searing flash, stood a figure so commanding it stole the very air from her lungs. He was a man, but not like the men she remembered from town. He stood tall and unyielding in the storm, his bare chest slick with rain, every muscle etched in sharp relief. Beneath bronze skin, long black hair clung to his shoulders, wild strands whipping across his face, and around his neck and chest hung tribal jewelry of turquoise, bone, and leather that gleamed each time lightning ripped across the sky. In his hand he steadied the reins of a trembling horse, its mane plastered against its neck, nostrils flaring with fear. Sarah's first instinct was to slam the door shut and bar it fast. This stranger did not belong here. He was a shadow pulled straight from the desert, untamed, fierce, dangerous. Yet something about the way he stood, silent in the storm, held her frozen in place. His eyes met hers, dark, steady, and unreadable. They did not burn with cruelty like the men she feared, nor did they carry the pity she had come to despise. His gaze was heavy, yes, but not unkind. In those eyes she saw storms older than the one raging outside. He did not speak. He only inclined his head slightly, as though asking without words what her silence could not answer. Her pulse thundered. Words rose in her chest, clawing to be released, but no sound came. She hadn't spoken in 10 years, not since the fire. And the whispers that followed. Her lips parted, trembling, but nothing spilled out. She gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles whitened. The man shifted his weight, and Sarah noticed the wound. Blood seeped through a strip of rawhide tied hastily around his ribs. Even in the dim lamp glow, she could see it was deep. His breathing was steady but strained, and he leaned slightly as though every movement pulled at the injury. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, so bright it turned the world white. In that instant she saw him fully, the warrior in the storm, the blood on his side, the horse shaking against the desert wind, and something inside her broke loose. Against all reason, she stepped back and opened the door wider. The warrior ducked his head to enter. He moved with quiet grace, his presence filling the small cabin. The air changed around him, denser, charged, as though the storm outside had followed him in. He led his horse only to the threshold, then released the reins, letting the animal stand half-sheltered beneath the overhang. Sarah quickly shut the door against the gale, her hands trembling. When the latch clicked into place, the cabin sank into a muffled quiet. The storm raged just beyond the walls, but here it was only wind and wood groaning. The warrior stood still, rain dripping from his hair onto the dirt floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them stretched, thick and fragile. Sarah felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he had come, what hunted him into the storm, but her voice lay buried in ashes she could not dig through. Instead, she moved carefully, her body speaking where her lips could not. She gestured to the chair by the table, then to the wound seeping red. Her eyes flicked to the basin of water, the folded claws she used for her own small hurts. The warrior's gaze followed her every motion. He seemed to understand. Slowly, with deliberate calm, he lowered himself into the chair. The effort cost him. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his breath hissed through his teeth. Sarah hurried to fetch the basin. She set it on the table, dipping a cloth into the cool water. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped it. It had been years since she had touched another person. Years since she had offered help to anyone but herself. When her hand brushed his skin, warm and unyielding beneath the rain and blood, a shiver ran through her. She pressed the cloth gently to the wound. He didn't flinch, though his muscles tensed beneath her touch. His eyes never left her face. She worked in silence, washing away the blood, wrapping the gash with fresh cloth torn from an old sheet. Her fingers were careful, almost reverent, as if each motion carried weight she couldn't explain. The warrior's breathing steadied, though the storm outside roared louder than ever. When at last she finished, she sat back, exhausted though she had barely moved. The lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across his features, sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that held secrets like canyon depths. He had not spoken a single word. Yet she felt somehow that he understood her silence. The storm battered the cabin walls, but inside another storm brewed quieter, more dangerous. For the first time in 10 years, Sarah was not alone. The storm raged on, its fist pounding against the cabin walls, but inside the silence grew thick, heavy with questions neither dared to voice. Sarah sat at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the taste of fear and dust still clinging to her lips. Across from her, the warrior sat with his wound freshly bound, his dark eyes steady on her as though he were studying not just her face, but the very marrow of her soul. He hadn't spoken, not a single word. Yet his silence was not. Like hers, it wasn't born of loss or exile. His silence was chosen, deliberate, like a knife waiting to be unsheathed. Sarah could feel it pressing against her, a silence alive with meaning. The lamp flickered, struggling against the draft. Its light painted his features in shades of amber and shadow. Each time she glanced at him, her eyes caught on details she hadn't noticed before. The turquoise beads strung between bones on the leather cord across his chest, the faint scars crisscrossing his arms, the way his long hair gleamed like black river water in the glow. He looked like a man carved from the desert itself, weathered, enduring, untamed. Sarah's throat ached with unspoken words. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he had come, whether he brought danger to her door. But even if she tried, nothing would come out. For 10 years she had buried her voice in silence, until the very thought of speaking felt like reaching for a weapon she no longer knew how to wield. Instead, she rose slowly and moved toward the hearth. The fire had burned low, only embers now, glowing faintly red. She fed it kindling, coaxing the flames back to life, until warmth began to creep once more into the small room. The warrior's eyes followed her movements, not sharp with suspicion but calm, as though he knew she meant him no harm. When she returned to the table, she placed a wooden cup before him and filled it with water from a clay jug. Her hand trembled as she slid it toward him, but he accepted without hesitation. His fingers brushed the rim, calloused and strong, before lifting the cup to his lips. He drank deeply, then set it down with a soft thud. For a long while, they simply looked at one another. Sarah felt as though her silence were no longer a wall but a bridge, fragile, narrow, but something he understood instinctively. It was then she realized he wasn't here by accident. Whatever had driven him to her door, it wasn't chance. Her eyes dropped to his wound again. The cloth she had tied around his ribs was already stained through with red, though not as heavily as before. He would live, but only if he rested. Outside, the storm clawed at the earth, a reminder that neither of them could leave yet. Sarah stood and fetched an old quilt from the trunk in the corner. Its colors faded but still warm. She draped it over his shoulders with hesitant care. For an instant, her hand lingered near his skin, and she felt the heat of him radiating beneath the dampness of rain. He looked up at her, his eyes catching hers with a force that rooted her to the spot. In that gaze, she felt something stir. Not pity, not judgment, something steadier, heavier. Like recognition. She backed away quickly, retreating into the safety of her silence, and sat in the chair opposite him. She clasped her hands tightly, trying to still the trembling. The warrior shifted, resting his elbows on his knees, his body curling forward slightly. He winced at the pain in his side but bore it without complaint. Then, with deliberate care, he reached into a small pouch at his belt and drew out a carved piece of bone etched with symbols she did not recognize. He set it on the table between them, pushing it toward her. Sarah's breath caught. The piece was beautiful, weathered smooth by time, its carvings intricate and deliberate. She reached for it, her fingers brushing its surface. When she looked back at him, his expression had changed. His silence seemed to say, "This is my bargain. I give this, and you give me shelter." Her chest ached. She hadn't asked for company. She hadn't asked to break the solitude she had lived in for 10 years. But something in the way he sat there, bleeding yet unbowed, made her realize she couldn't send him back into the storm. Sarah set the bone gently back on the table and gave the smallest of nods. The warrior's jaw tightened. His expression unreadable, but she thought she saw the faintest glimmer in his eyes. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, the first fragile threads of trust were spun in silence. The storm did not ease. If anything, it grew angrier, shaking the cabin as though it meant to pry the roof from its beams. Sarah sat rigid in her chair, staring into the wavering lamplight, listening to the thunder crack overhead. Across from her, the warrior remained still, watchful, silent, his body at rest though his eyes never slept. He was a presence she could neither ignore nor explain, and it made her restless in a way she hadn't felt for years. Her mind fought to stay anchored in the present, on the storm, on the stranger before her, but the past seeped in anyway, crawling through the cracks of her memory like smoke. The fire. It had been late summer when the blaze swept through her old life. She remembered the sound first, the roar of flames devouring timber, the shrieks of horses bolting in panic. Heat pressed against her like a living hand, blistering skin and filling her lungs with poison. She had stumbled through black smoke, clutching at her throat, until pain seared the inside of her chest. That was when the scream caught and never came out. That was when her voice disappeared. But the fire wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst had come after, when the town whispered that she had brought it down upon them. A dropped lamp, they said. Carelessness. Some swore it was punishment. God's wrath for her sins. Her husband had been the first to turn his face away. Then her friends. Then everyone. Her silence became their proof. And so she left. Now, in the half-light of the cabin, she traced the scar at her collarbone with trembling fingers, as though it were a brand she could never erase. Her eyes flicked to the warrior, and she froze. He was watching her, not with pity, but with something heavier, something she almost recognized. He bore his scars differently. His wounds were not hidden. They marked his body like the rings of an old tree, each one telling a story of survival. The gash at his ribs, the faded lines across his forearms, the weary set of his shoulders. He, too, was a man cast out. She didn't need words to know it. She could see exile in his eyes, the way he scanned the shadows, always braced for enemies that might come through the door. For a fleeting moment, their silences met. Different roads had brought them here, hers paved with fire and shame, his perhaps with war and betrayal, but the weight was the same. Outcasts, bound not by choice, but by survival. Sarah turned back to the hearth, poking at the fire until sparks rose like restless spirits. Her hand shook, not from cold but from the memories clawing at her chest. She needed to bury them again, to retreat into the hollow safety of silence, but the warrior broke the stillness, not with words, with a sound low, steady, rhythmic. His hand brushed the necklace at his chest, and from somewhere deep in his throat came a hum. A song, though, like any she had ever heard. It was raw, ancient, carried in tones that seemed older than the desert itself. The melody rose and fell like the storm outside, but gentler, like a river carving stone over centuries. Sarah froze, caught in the sound. It wasn't meant for her, she could feel that. It was for him, for something unseen, perhaps for ancestors who walked in the teal. Thunder. Yet somehow it reached her, curling through the hollow spaces of her silence, filling her with something she hadn't felt in years, warmth, her eyes stung. She pressed her hands together, knuckles white, fighting back tears. 10 years of silence had left her voice buried, but hearing his so strong, so sure, was like touching water after a decade of drought. When the hum faded, the cabin seemed larger, emptier without it. He leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable, though she thought she saw a softness at the corners of his eyes. Sarah swallowed hard. Her throat burned as though her body were daring her to try, daring her to break the chains of silence. But when she opened her mouth, only air came. No sound, just a shaking breath that left her hollow. Her eyes dropped to the carved bone he had given her, still lying on the table between them. She traced the etched lines with her fingertip, trying to read the meaning within them. A token? A promise? A plea? The storm roared louder, and her lamp guttered in the wind. She tightened her grip on the bone. Outside, shadows moved in the night shadows. That didn't belong to the storm. Sarah's chest clenched. Whoever this warrior was, he wasn't the only one wandering the desert tonight. The storm had not tired. It raged with the fury of a living thing, tearing at the world outside. Yet beneath its roar came another sound, one that chilled Sarah's blood more than any thunderclap. Hooves. At first faint, muffled by wind and rain. Then louder galloping, many of them, pounding like war drums across the desert floor. She stiffened, her hands tightening around the quilt draped across her lap. For a heartbeat, she tried to tell herself it was only her imagination, the storm playing tricks. But then came the cruel laughter, carried sharp and clear through the howling wind. Sarah's breath caught. Riders. Her eyes darted to the shutters. Through the thin slits of wood, she saw them. 6 shadows moving in a loose circle, their horses restless and snorting, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold. Rain. Lightning flashed, revealing glints of rifles and pistols, hats pulled low, faces hard and hungry. These weren't lost travelers. They were men who hunted. The warrior was already on his feet before she could move. He rose like a blade unsheathed, his body taut, every muscle alive with readiness. One hand gripped the knife at his belt. The other pressed briefly to his side where the bandage already soaked with blood. Pain licked across his features, but he stood unbowed. Sarah's chest burned. She wanted to cry out, to warn him, to scream at the riders to go, but her voice, as always, betrayed her. 10 years of silence pinned her tongue like iron. She pressed a trembling hand to his arm instead, her wide eyes pleading what her lips could not. Don't go out there. Not alone. He looked down at her, and for a moment their breaths mingled. In the dim lamplight, his gaze softened, but only for a breath. Then his eyes flicked to the rifle mounted above the hearth. Sarah followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. The rifle. She hadn't touched it since the fire. The thought of it in her hands again made her heart pound as if it might break through her ribs. She had sworn never to raise a weapon, never to feel its kick against her shoulder, never to be a part of violence again. but the pounding at the door shattered her vow. The first blow came like a hammer, rattling the hinges, making the lamp shutter on the table. A man's voice rang out, harsh and mocking. "Open up in there. We seen the horse. Ain't no use hiding." Another blow. Wood splintered, sharp and angry. Sarah staggered back, her breath shallow, her hands pressed against her mouth to trap the soundless scream clawing inside her chest. The warrior did not flinch. He moved to the shadows by the door, knife gleaming faintly in the lamplight. His posture was that of a predator waiting for prey to step too close. Lightning flashed again, and Sarah saw his eyes. They burned with a calm ferocity, ready for blood. Another rider's voice. "Come on out, Injun. You can't hide in there forever." Laughter followed, cruel and sharp. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached up to the hearth. Dusk fell from the rifle as her fingers wrapped around its stock. The wood felt foreign in her grasp, heavier than she remembered. She lifted it down, her breath uneven, her chest tight with memories of her father's voice teaching her to shoot. She had sworn never again. But survival has no room for vows. The men outside struck the door again, and this time it cracked at the edge. Rain sprayed through the gap, the storm eager to follow them, and Sarah turned, rifle in hand. The warriors. Eyes flicked to her, and for a heartbeat the storm seemed to vanish, the world narrowing to just the two of them. His gaze met hers, dark, steady, and approving, not commanding, not demanding. "Just trust." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat burning. Her hands shook, but she steadied the barrel with all the strength she had left. Outside, the riders shouted. Inside, the silence was louder than any thunder. For the first time in 10 years, Sarah wanted to break it. And then the door splintered open. The cabin erupted into chaos the instant the door burst open. Rain and wind howled in with the intruders, their boots pounding on the wooden floor, their faces lit with the cruel hunger of men who thought themselves wolves. 6 riders had surrounded the place, but only 3 forced their way inside at once. Weapons raised, eyes searching for plunder or worse. Sarah froze where she stood near the hearth, her hands trembling on the old rifle. She could hardly breathe, every nerve screaming. But this was the moment her silence and her fear would cost her life. 10 years of hiding, of burying her voice, of living like a ghost. What good would it do her now, with violence already inside her home? But she wasn't alone. The warrior was no longer just a shadow in her cabin. He was thunder made flesh. He moved with startling speed for a man wounded, his long black hair whipping like a wild banner as he lunged forward. The first raider barely had time to lift his pistol before the warrior's knife flashed. A scream split through the storm. As the man staggered backward, clutching his arm, blood darkening his sleeve, the second intruder raised his rifle, but the warrior slammed into him with the force of a charging stallion. The two crashed against the table, shattering it into splinters, the carved bone token tumbling to the floor. Sarah's heart lurched at the sight of it, as if fate itself had been knocked into the dirt. The third man sneered at her, perhaps thinking the woman would be easy prey while the warrior fought. He stepped toward her, hand reaching. Something in Sarah broke free, then not into fear, but into fire. She pulled the trigger. The old rifle exploded in her hands, the recoil nearly knocking her off her feet. The shot thundered through the cabin, deafening in the small space, and the raider stumbled back with a howl, blood blooming across his leg. Sarah gasped, her chest heaving, the gun clattering from her shaking hands. The warrior had seen. Even in the blur of battle, his dark eyes locked on hers for an instant, a flicker of respect, of shared defiance. She wasn't only a frightened woman in rags. She had stood her ground, but the fight was far from over. More shadows loomed outside, lightning revealing grim faces, rifles ready. The men inside regrouped, snarling curses. One lunged again at the warrior slamming a fist against his wounded ribs. He staggered, teeth clenched, pain flashing across his features. For a heartbeat, Sarah thought he might fall. Instead, he roared a sound that was half battle cry, half fury from the marrow of his bones. He drove his knife upward, catching the man under the chin, the blade glinting in the lamplight. The raider collapsed in a heap, his boots kicking against the floorboards before falling still. The remaining two inside hesitated. The storm shrieked around the cabin, shutters banging, rain spattering across the floor. In that pause, Sarah scrambled for the rifle again, clumsy but determined. While the warrior steadied himself against the wall, the intruders cursed and fled back through the broken door, yelling for their comrades. Outside, the horses shrieked and reared at the smell of blood and the crack of thunder. The men regrouped, their angry voices carrying through the storm. "They won't stop," Sarah whispered, voice barely audible even to herself, but it was a voice, the first word she had spoken in 10 years. It slipped out raw, cracked, but real. The warrior turned his head toward her, and though he said nothing, his eyes told her he had heard. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, his knife still slick in his hand, his tribal jewelry catching the lamplight like a glimmer of defiance against the dark. Another blow rattled the cabin door frame, this one from outside as the raiders prepared to rush again. Sarah pressed her back against the hearth, her mind reeling. She had spoken. The silence that had bound her for a decade had shattered in the storm. The warrior stepped to her side, his presence towering, unyielding. If the men returned, and they would, then this battle would not end quietly. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt her own spirit rising to meet it. The night had broken into silence, an eerie, loaded quiet that clung to the cabin like smoke after a fire. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised sky and the smell of wet earth. Sarah's breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she pressed herself against the back wall, the rifle clutched loosely in her hands. Her knuckles were raw, her palms slick with sweat. In the center of the room, amidst splintered wood and the smell of blood, the warrior stood. His chest rose and fell like a drumbeat, his powerful shoulders gleaming in the faint light of the oil lamp that still sputtered on the mantel. His long black hair clung damp against his back, strands falling over his fierce eyes. He held his knife steady, the blade dark with blood, though his hand trembled now not from fear, but from the deep wound at his ribs. Two raiders lay sprawled across the floorboards, lifeless. Another crawled toward the door, groaning, dragging himself into the mud outside where the rain had washed away blood trails. Only one still stood, leaning against the doorframe, eyes wide with terror as he took in the sight of the warrior. "You're cursed." The man spat, his voice breaking, half belief and half dread. "You're not human." The warrior said nothing. His silence carried more weight than words. His eyes locked on the outlaw with the stillness of a predator ready to strike again. Sarah saw the outlaw's courage collapse. He dropped his weapon, stumbling back into the darkness of the night, the sound of his retreat swallowed by the drenched earth. And just like that, it was over. The warrior's knees gave way and he slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. His knife clattered onto the floor. Sarah startled forward, her rifle forgotten, rushing to his side. Her trembling hands pressed against the soaked bandage at his ribs. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking, the first true word she had spoken to another soul in 10 years. Her throat burned with the effort, the sound rusty, fragile. But it was a word, a plea, a prayer. The warrior's eyes flicked up to hers, sharp even in his pain, and for a moment, Sarah felt as if he had heard her silence long before she had broken it. "Stay with me," she rasped, forcing the words past her lips, her tears mingling with the blood she tried to stop. "Don't leave." The warrior's lips parted, a faint curl of breath escaping. His voice was deep, quiet, but steady despite his wound. "You have strength," he said, his accent wrapping around the words like smoke. "Your silence was not weakness." Her tears spilled freely then, as if 10 years of locked-away grief had burst. She tore strips of cloth from her dress, pressing them against his wound with shaking determination. "I thought I was dead inside," she whispered. "But you came. You made me fight again." The warrior studied her with an unreadable expression, then lifted a trembling hand, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man built for battle. "You chose life," he said simply. Dawn broke over. The horizon, light filtering in through the cracked shutters, painting the room in hues of gold. The storm had washed the land clean, leaving the world smelling of rain and new earth. The silence that filled the cabin now was no longer suffocating, but alive, punctuated by the crackling of the fire Sarah had stirred back to life. By the sound of the warrior's steady breathing, she sat close to him, watching his chest rise and fall, her own voice still trembling from disuse but stronger now than it had been in years. She realized something profound. Silence had once been her prison, but now it was her choice. And choice, she understood, was freedom. As the sun lifted, she whispered again, this time not to herself, not to ghosts of the past, but to the man who had changed everything. "My name is Sarah," she said softly, her voice fragile but certain, "and I'm not afraid anymore." The warrior's lips curved, just slightly, his dark eyes closing as exhaustion took him. Yet even in sleep, he seemed more alive than anyone she had ever known. Sarah rose, standing at the doorway where the storm had torn the world apart only hours ago. The land stretched endlessly before her, golden under the morning light. She could hear birds singing again. Life had returned, and as she looked back at the warrior resting in her cabin, she knew with unshakable clarity that silence would never own her again. She had been given back her voice, and with it, a reason to live.